Okay, everybody, if you could start to take your seats. We'll get ready for the first session of the afternoon. Hope you all had a nice lunch. So our next session is lifting up our eyes from the UK and looking to the global impact of the pandemic. And we've got a fantastic panel, and leading it from Bloomberg is Lizzy Burden. Lizzy, come and bring your team out with you.
Hope you've all enjoyed your lunch. Well, thank you for joining us and welcome to Talking Economics. It's organised by the Economics Observatory and Bristol Ideas. The Festival of Economics is now in its 10th year, and we have economists and experts from all across the world, especially on this panel. And this is the first year that we've had all these morning additional sessions. So please do follow the hashtags Talking Economics and Economics Fest on Twitter and the Economics Observatory and Bristol Ideas accounts. I'm Lizzy Burden. I'm a UK economy reporter at Bloomberg. And it's brilliant to be joined by Lotanna Emediegwu, who's a lecturer at Manchester Metropolitan University, and he's an expert on environmental economics, climate econometrics, spatial econometrics, agricultural economics, and applied econometrics. That was a mouthful. We also have Zsoka Koczan, who is a senior economist at the EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Her current research focuses on within-country income disparities, migration, and inequality. I've gone out of order here. Between Lotanna and Zsoka, we have Vyoma Dhar Sharma, who's a research student at the University of Oxford. Her expertise lies in reproductive and child health in India, where she's recently been doing some field work, which you'll hear some more about. And Bethan Staton, a fellow journalist at the Financial Times. She writes about public policy and education and was previously based in the Middle East. So you can see we've got expertise from lots of regions here. We can pretty much cover the globe. And I want to start with you, Lotanna. If you can just tell us in 2 minutes the most striking thing that's happened in Africa in the pandemic that we just wouldn't know about.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lizzy. It's a pleasure to be here and to be part of this Talking Economics. In terms of the pandemic actually was a global shock that shook the whole world. But in terms of the impact it had on sub-Saharan Africa in particular, it's quite kind of diverse from what we think it had in the other developed part of the world. One of the major things that really happened in sub-Saharan Africa as a result of the pandemic is that it wasn't really taken as seriously as it ought to be, and that could be quite surprising for some of you that have never been to sub-Saharan Africa before. Kind of life continued as it were, even despite we have some government lockdown. And the reason behind that is simply because of the reported low rate of infection and mortality rate, which we will find out later that it could be that could come through due to some reasons that different scholars have proposed. So the basic striking thing is that it wasn't really kind of taken as seriously as it ought to be in sub-Saharan Africa. And the reason for that we'll share on as we continue in the discussion. So that's what really captured my attention in the whole pandemic scenario. While the other parts of the world are going on lockdowns and the citizens are kind of obeying the instructions, we have some parts of the world where despite there is an announcement of lockdown, but it's not really taken much serious as a result of cultural and societal norms in these parts of the world. So I'll stop there for now, and then we'll come back to it later.
Brilliant. There's a lot to come back to. Vyoma, the most striking thing in India that we wouldn't know.
Thank you. Since I work on reproductive health policy and problematizing reproductive health policy in India, I'm going to take a minute and maybe talk about the gendered impact that the pandemic has had. The last 2 years, and also lessons from other epidemics across the world, have taught us that there are long-lasting effects on gender equality. Domestically in India, school closures and housebound isolation increased women's caregiving responsibilities manifold. In India, thousands of women went into labor daily under lockdown restrictions. When primary healthcare centers in my field site of Uttar Pradesh, rural Uttar Pradesh, refused to offer admission and treatment without a negative COVID test report, many women avoided the facilities altogether. This meant delaying care seeking for serious illnesses and resorting to giving birth at home. Lack of adequate transport and emergency services were real life-threatening issues for many who faced obstetric complications. As nurses and health workers on the ground, women constitute the majority of India's low-paid health workforce at the greatest risk of contagion. During the lockdown, conducting home visits and thermal screenings took precedence over following up with pregnant women, which meant that antenatal checkups, ultrasound screenings were all suspended amongst other services for women. Poor families were also pushed to seek care in the unregulated private sector. Many women insisted that there was no coronavirus in the village, and this is a point that I can come back to later in the discussion. I suppose the larger argument that I would want to make here is that shedding light on the gendered nature of COVID-19 is not to take away from the real problem, but I would ask you to maybe look beyond the pathophysiological aspects of disease and also think about, the socioeconomic or the cultural aspects that create and distribute illness. So, yeah, thank you.
I'm sure there'll be questions about that. Okay, the European picture, Zsoka.
Thank you very much. So I think I would highlight that on the one hand, while the pandemic is really broad-based, how uneven its impact has been. So my favorite economist, Branko Milanovic, described the COVID-19 crisis as the first truly global event in the history of humankind. Wars have been predominantly local over the last 75 or so years. Even the Football World Cup was only watched by a sixth of the world's population, whereas the pandemic really affected people independently of their country of residence, independently of their social class. And I think the numbers at the aggregate level are already quite striking. So the IMF estimates that global output contracted by over 3% during the COVID-19 crisis, whereas the global financial crisis that viewed from advanced economies, many of us remember as the most recent severe crisis, only dragged that number slightly below zero. And this, of course, was the effect of domestic containment measures that resulted in drops in mobility, external factors. But I think what is most striking to me is how uneven both the impact of the crisis and the recovery has been, both across countries. So COVID-19 triggered a shift away from consumption of services, whether that's international travel or eating out, towards consumption of goods. Now, this means that on the one hand, it benefits countries that are important, for instance, manufacturing exporters. Many of the economies in Central Europe and the Baltic states have benefited from this and have seen sharp rebounds. But on the other hand, given international travel restrictions and containment measures, economies that are very dependent on services, in particular tourism, face a much more uncertain outlook. And this too affects some of the economies in Southeastern Europe or North Africa, for example. But the impact has also been highly unequal within countries. There's been a lot of research showing, both in advanced economies and in emerging markets, that those hardest hit were the young, those with lower levels of education and income, on temporary contracts, as well as women. And I think the gender dimension is interesting because the global financial crisis was more a crisis of manufacturing, whereas COVID-19, given the nature of restrictions, impacted services much more, so had a disproportionate impact on women and younger workers. So it was highly unequal within countries, and in that it also exacerbated some of the pre-existing trends. It was also highly unequal in how it affected the use of digital technologies. So this is actually my first in-person event after more than a year and a half.
What
and
a
it's
privilege.
really a pleasure to be talking to people in 3D rather than at my screen, even if I can't do so wearing PJ bottoms. But it also highlights the difference between some parts of the population which were really able to take advantage of rapidly increasing digitalization and really an overnight shift to remote working and remote learning, and parts of the population which are increasingly left out of these benefits of digitalization. And I think I'll end there.
Brilliant. And finally, the Middle East. What wouldn't we know?
Well, I mean, I think the striking thing about the impact of the pandemic in the Middle East is that it's been experienced in many countries as a kind of crisis upon a crisis or crises. So there's obviously instances of conflict that have weakened states, left them unable to roll out the kind of support mechanisms such as furlough and so on, which we've had in the UK. Probably the most striking example of kind of economic turmoil now is Lebanon. I'm sure you're all aware we've got high levels of debt, weak government, rocketing kind of cost of living, and very high levels of unemployment, which during the pandemic were exacerbated by lockdowns and have resulted in problems like, difficulty accessing food, medicines, and so on. One of the things we've sort of seen regionally in response to some of these issues, youth unemployment, for example, is really, really striking and alarmingly high, as a sort of growing despair and a need to leave, as well as people being displaced by conflict, a higher number of people fleeing economic turmoil, and especially kind of young people. And then I'm glad you noted that this is a kind of global crisis, that as you're moving, you're meeting with borders in Europe that are increasingly militarized, and the response in Europe is to kind of roll back into nationalism and shut down. So I think the links to that kind of global picture are really important to note.
Zsoka, I want to come back to something that you said. You said it was the first truly global event. What about climate change? What can we transpose to that global event that's been going on for so long?
I think the COVID-19 crisis turned people's attention to climate change, but the effect that will have on people's willingness to pay for a greener future could go either way. So on the one hand, we're faced with increasing energy prices, partly as a result of really limited investment in fossil fuels in the last few years. We see oil prices have rebounded, gas prices in Europe are at historic highs. So this means that people will be faced with much higher utility bills. Now, people in emerging markets already generally spend more on utilities as a share of their income than people in advanced economies. It's also something that places a disproportionate burden on the poor, who again, as a share of their income, spend more on utilities than those in richer households. So as people are faced really with higher prices of petrol and utilities, this may test the public's resolve for greening. Now at EBRD, we've done some research looking at how personal experiences during the COVID crisis affects attitudes towards the environment. We found that people who experienced economic shocks during the crisis, so job losses or income losses in their household, became more environmentally aware. But at the same time, we find that their willingness to pay for a greener future remains largely unchanged, because at the same time, their income also falls. We do find that people who had a COVID-19 case in the household become also more environmentally aware, but this effect is really driven by country countries where the internet is free and where this is linked in the media more as well. So in that sense, it could be an opportunity to link people's personal experiences more to their views on climate change. We know that people who have more exposure to pollution over their lifetimes are more supportive of greener policies, but at the same time it also means that the costs and the trade-offs of these, whether it's green versus growth or really increasing utility bills to pay for this, will make it a more difficult political debate.
It's interesting to cover the energy security situation and thinking as well about food security. Vyoma, India's had one of the toughest lockdowns, so how has that affected food price stability?
I can talk to you a bit about my field site and how it impacted sort of the end user. And in this sense, women's responsibility also increases and it has a bearing on their health. I did have some insights about, so during April, roughly March end to May was a particularly difficult time for households in rural Uttar Pradesh last year. That was the most severe lockdown. And it was severe because men of the house were out of jobs. They couldn't step out. And you have to keep in mind that this is mostly a largely informal daily wage working community. So if there's no income coming in the house, they had absolutely no access to food. That compromised diets, that compromised nutrition in rather persistent manner. And
Lotanna, you went to the University of Benin. You're from Nigeria. I really want to ask about how your friends and family back home are telling you about their experiences. What on an individual level, how are people being impacted all the way through and even now?
Yeah, thank you. Like I did pointed out at my opening remarks, that I have family members in Nigeria and friends in Benin, friends in South Africa, Ghana, and it's still the problem we have is the problem of trust in terms of the government, what the government is talking about. So the pandemic is out there. At least I've had friends that have lost family members as a result of the pandemic in Africa. But the acceptability of what the government is trying to do to mitigate this tide, this viral tide, is very low amongst my friends, and especially those that are rooted in traditional religion or religious practices. So, and this is because of past government experiences from past government failures in terms of delivery, political promises, and there is a research that have shown that, a theoretical research that have shown that where government has failed to deliver on promises in the past, it has impact on future trust, fidelity in terms of what the people can expect from the government. So that has really been a barrier in terms of the government trying to communicate the impact of this disease as well as the way to, cushion the effect. On the other hand, because we have a problem of internet connectivity, where some parts of the country or some parts of the region are kind of cut off from the mainstream media, talking about the international mainstream media, where they can gain more verified information about it. So it deepens the problem of information. So once the information is not there, it becomes difficult for people to understand that this thing is real and then there is a way out of it. So that's been the problem with some of my friends and kind of some of my family members, especially from the traditional perspective. They will tell you that no, the government is just trying to deceive them, and trying to make money out of them or something. So that's the basic experience, personal experience, I would say.
But when it comes to the cultural barriers that stop people taking the vaccine, how do you get around that?
Yeah, in traditional societies, especially in terms of the people are more loyal to the traditional rulers and their religious leaders than even the government. And if the government wants to get the message across to the citizens, one thing it can do is to go through the informal channel in terms of talking to the religious leaders or convincing the traditional leaders about the import of this whole system. And doing that, if they are able to convince adequately these traditional rulers and religious leaders who have lots of followers and because African society is a traditional society where we really have social cultures and norms that guide our ways of lives. So if they are really able to convince these, and the good thing is that most of these religious leaders and traditional leaders are very educated, so it wouldn't be difficult to really, and they are well exposed and read, so it won't be difficult to convince them and explain to them. So if they are able to pass the message across to them, they can now transmit the messages to their followers, who will definitely want to abide to avoid incurring the wrath of these leaders. And the other thing the government could do, just like what they normally do during political campaign, is to bring about a carrot approach, an approach where you incentivize the uptake of, for example, the vaccine, or the uptake of some other mechanisms that will mitigate or suppress the infection rate. But the challenge with that is that, being most of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa are low-income countries, it begs to the question of whether the funding is there to even incentivize the people, where the basic necessities of life has not been provided because of funding and because of low income. So if that has to be done, the government of the country needs to collaborate with external or foreign agency or foreign governments and look for foreign aids, so that they can use that to incentivize the populace that probably get a vaccine and get this extra thing.
Is there as much of a problem with encouraging vaccine take-up in the Middle East, Bethan?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's a lot about access as much as anything, being able to get hold of the vaccine itself, distribution systems. I mean, in circumstances where people are living in refugee camps, there's dependence on international aid distributions there, but they're always not even second in line. One thing that was really interesting about vaccines was that in the region was Israel was the one of the fastest rollouts, but the neighbouring Palestinian territories, obviously the flow of vaccines is controlled by Israel to an extent, were much slower to get that rolled out. That's a problem when it's a problem for Israel when there's also flows of people across the border all the time. And that example, I think, really sort of highlighted to me that, if your neighbours, if you're controlling the flow of medicines, then there are consequences. Even if you're a fully vaccinated population, it's all interconnected.
It really shows the subject of this panel, the global virus, global impact. One thing that I think is absolutely mad is that India was manufacturing vaccines for places like the UK, and it hadn't completely vaccinated its population. What was the access like in India, and did the fact that India was manufacturing vaccines create diplomatic headaches of its own?
Yeah, that's a. let me try and answer that. I think the last estimate is that India has vaccinated like 23% of its fully vaccinated 23% of its population. But the size of the country should tell you something. There have been billions, at least over 1 billion doses that have been given out, but it's still a huge challenge to fully vaccinate people. India, in terms of producing generic medicines for developed countries or for WHO, India has always been one of the primary manufacturers in terms of pharmaceutical capacity. In my field site, so in January 2021, earlier this year, was when I conducted fieldwork. At that point, the vaccine rollout hadn't begun. But there was a huge amount of interest. There was keenness in the population amongst the women in the village I was in to talk about it, to take the vaccine when it becomes available. When it does come to the COVID vaccine, there's a two-part point that I would want to make. Since the beginning of the pandemic, the vaccine was a highly anticipated solution. And it has efficacy, it has a use that cannot be denied. But where it becomes a bit problematic, as you know, the kind of disparity that we've observed in the availability of the vaccine tells you that while you may put a lot of trust in technomedical solutions, when you can't solve for these kind of disparities, we should engage with the issue beyond its magic bullet properties, because vaccines are not magic bullets. Secondly, I would also say that vaccines, again, efficacy is proven, it's efficient against controlling and bringing down the numbers, but vaccines can't solve for the fact that social distancing remains a highly impossible solution if you live in a dense neighborhood, in New Delhi, for instance, right? So yes, important, but there are all these other aspects about operationalizing it which we haven't really considered.
You in Africa, Vyoma, you mentioned the cultural barriers to women taking up healthcare. And for Lotanna, he said the answer was to engage with religious leaders. What's the answer in India with women? How do you, if they are worried about having to go to hospital in case they might enter quarantine and they don't know what's going to happen to them, how do you solve that?
It's women have a very interesting role as far as health seeking at the ground level is concerned. So as I mentioned a bit in my opening remarks, as ASHA workers, some of you might be familiar with the term, that's the frontline health worker. So these are women from the villages who've been trained in dealing with, managing pregnancies in the community. They know all about immunization. They encourage health seeking in the community. But these are also women who are given a huge burden of all sorts of, so they take care of tuberculosis, they take care of all kinds of communicable and non-communicable diseases. When COVID came in, they were given these thermal screening machines, and they had to go house to house. So on the one hand, they're seen as these recipients of reproductive health, and targets, mind you, of reproductive health policies, but as functionaries who are paid minimal for the efforts that they put in. There's a lot of responsibility, and there's only one person per community. So there are only so many hours in a person's day. So she can either do thermal screening, she can either do follow-up with women. But it's a complicated, there's no easy answer here. On the one hand, health facilities were rather stringent in asking people to produce a negative COVID report before they entered the facility. But when women who come from, there's a certain amount of restriction in you stepping out of the house. So if you know that if I turn out to be COVID positive and I will be taken away to an isolation facility, I'd rather go without seeking care as opposed to risk that.
Are there any issues like that in Europe? It seems much closer to us, but in the area that you cover, Zsoka, are there any of these cultural barriers to taking the vaccine that need to be overcome?
So the heterogeneity, even within emerging Europe, Central Asia, the Caucasus, parts of North Africa that we cover is striking. I mean, on average in these countries, share of vaccinated population is now probably around 30-something% compared with 70-something% in advanced economies. But we see really a lot of variation, even across countries that, for instance, all have the same access to availability of vaccines through EU-wide treaties. So we see a lot of heterogeneity in the new member states. Early on, there was a lot of debate about what might be behind the low take-up in some of these countries. So it's here, in this case, it wouldn't be availability. It could be logistical issues. And indeed, even in some countries in emerging Europe, we see that vaccinations have initially progressed very quickly, but now they're really flattening off because they're having difficulties in reaching rural populations. It's really, in Hungary, for example, a lot of urban residents are getting their third shot, whereas sort of 4 million people out of a country of 10 million haven't even received their first. And in part, it also highlights the digital divide that I mentioned earlier. So you're required to register online. It's a two-step process. There are essentially no walk-up clinics, only very recently. So this really limits the rollout to more rural areas. Some people have also raised whether this is a question of trust, and if this is a legacy of perhaps more skepticism towards policies coming from above or the state in general, if this is related to trust in government. So we tried to look at this on a large sample of countries. So we looked at 85 economies and their vaccination rates and tried to look at what drives these. Some of the things we expected, so for instance, vaccination rates are much higher in richer economies, so those with higher levels of GDP per capita. They're generally higher where vaccination started earlier, so where the rollout started, for instance, in March or even earlier. And we find that they're higher where there is greater willingness among the population to take vaccines, and this is conditional even on the availability. Now, of course, willingness of people to take the vaccine is affected by the vaccination campaign in itself, but it's also related to the views they had before the pandemic. So it correlates quite closely with what people said in 2018, 2019 before the pandemic of whether they think vaccines in general are safe. There's also greater willingness to get vaccinated in countries with older populations, and we found that it's also greater in countries that had stricter lockdowns, so larger drops in mobility measured as trips to places of work, recreation, so where it was seen more as a solution to ending a lockdown.
I've got a couple more questions, but I hope that you're all brewing your own. I'm sure that there's lots of things you want to ask. Bethan, on this theme of inequality, how has the pandemic affected educational inequality globally?
Yeah, well, I think the sort of thematic issue of education is a really interesting one, and looking at inequalities, it's made global inequalities, so between countries, much greater, but also exacerbated and kind of heightened inequalities that exist within countries as well. And obviously, as schools were shut down, we rapidly changed the way children were educated. And the big side effect of that is that those who were disadvantaged anyway educationally have been more disadvantaged by shutdowns. So there's a big tech divide, and that's within countries as well as between countries internationally. Access to things like, Zoom lessons, laptops. At certain points in the pandemic, it dictated whether you were really able to access education at all.
And we saw that in the UK as well.
And we saw that in the UK too. So, in the UK, it was really common for children to be using one phone between, 5 siblings to do all their homework. And that was what education looked like. In some ways, there are quite interesting examples of how globally that problem has not been quite so pronounced. For example, I was looking at an example in Lahore, in Pakistan recently, where because it was less common for kids to have laptops and good tech at home, there wasn't quite so much kind of great inequalities between students. The approach was to provide pen and paper exercises and stuff that was always accessible, and it was reaching kids with the technology they had. So that's an interesting dynamic. But I think the other thing to bear in mind on really stark inequalities is that for some children, this won't be a break in education. It will be the end of their education. So if you're very economically precarious, if you're a girl in countries where there's big gender inequalities, if you have disabilities, if you are of religious or kind of ethnic minorities in certain countries, you already face so many barriers to, finishing your education, that if it stops and there's an economic crisis and you're taken out of school, the likelihood of you returning becomes very low. So that obviously is going to have huge impacts into the future as those young people enter the workforce or enter adulthood. So yeah, it's really difficult to think about solutions for that. It's a huge challenge.
And thinking about how to re-stimulate the economy after the pandemic, not just spending on education, but spending in all aspects. If I can come to you, Zsoka, about the fiscal stimulus packages, what stage is it actually appropriate to phase them out? Because in the UK, we seem to be very hasty to start tightening monetary policy and start balancing the books. But from a global perspective, other countries are still in boost mode. So when is it appropriate to turn off the taps?
So the COVID-19 crisis has seen in many countries unprecedented fiscal stimulus packages as governments try to support firms, they try to support households. We've seen a large increase in debt as a result, also driven by the fact that the denominator of debt to GDP ratio, so output itself, collapsed. So debt would increase by 10, 20 percentage points on average in emerging markets versus advanced economies. Now, these stimulus packages have protected a lot of workers, a lot of firms from losing their jobs, from going bankrupt. We do see that bankruptcies and non-performing loans, for example, are at levels even below those seen before the pandemic. So a lot of these lifelines are still keeping firms alive. There's still widespread furlough schemes that you mentioned earlier are still keeping many workers employed. There is a lot of variation across countries. So as you said, some economies are quite keen to start withdrawing support. And then I think at that point, we will really see the vulnerabilities of how many zombie firms are there out there, which were only kept alive through this support, how much unemployment will pick up then. In some countries, we do see inflation, for example, starting to pick up already because of these supply-demand mismatches, because of high energy prices, but in some actually because unemployment has come back down because there is a lot of pressure on wages. It's very difficult to say much on labor markets and a lot of emerging markets at this point because the statistics tend to come with a significant delay. So we were looking, for instance, at vacancies advertised online, and there we do really see a sharp pickup in some of the sectors that were hard hit, some lower middle skilled occupations, for instance, a lot of demand for drivers. And there is some wage growth that is feeding into inflation already. So in these economies, it might be time to start thinking about withdrawing stimulus. A number of central banks in emerging markets have hiked rates already. But then on the other hand, we have a lot of economies which are still far below their potential, where unemployment is still significantly higher than it was before the crisis. Some economies, we also see people dropping out of the labor force, and it remains to be seen whether this is a temporary withdrawal because they might be concerned about social contact, because they might be relying on a single source of income rather than several. Some of these might return, but where significant slack remains in labor markets, where unemployment is still high, where labor force participation has dropped a lot and is still low, it would still be good to keep continuing the support packages at least a while longer.
And I'm going to indulge myself with one very last question. Lotanna, I want to have the expert answer to this so that next time I'm in the pub and my friend asks me, I can answer it like an expert. There's obviously the flip side of all this fiscal stimulus is all the debt. Why can't we just write off the debt?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite not very straightforward to think about writing off the debt because you have the lender, then you have the borrower, and then countries run to the lenders, for example, the Paris Club or to China to solicit for debt and under some conditionalities and within a particular maturity period. So as we get to that maturity period, which normally these are long-term debts, which sometimes takes more than 10 years, and we expect that by then the economy should have stabilized and countries should be able to repay back their debt. But if after the maturity period there is a very reasonable evidence, while a country will not be able to repay its debt, depending on the magnanimity of the lender as well as the conditionality, the country can write for debt to be written off. But that is basically still left at the mercy of the lenders, and it depends on who the lenders are actually. Some lenders will unconditionally write off, like the Paris Club did to Nigeria, for Nigeria in 2006 or 7, where they wrote out billions of debt owed by Nigeria for over 30 years. But you have some other countries that will conditionally write it off, like, for example, China, where you will have to, probably give up something in your country, like the seaport or an airport or a general or whatever, an institution, and then they can write it up. So it's not just a Christmas cake. Just take debt and it's written off. No, because before the debt is given to you, you must have shown evidence, promises that you'll be able to repay back. And this evidence are done by economists that draft out the whole procedure and the possibility of repayment, because no lender is just dishing out money free of charge. So, but just like it happens when you borrow money from the bank, things can happen that are beyond your control, and then you can write for bad debt. So these things happen, and then countries can, over the years, write for the debts to be cancelled, and depending on what the conditionalities are, it could either be cancelled conditionally or unconditionally, depending.
So you might be written off on the financial side, but you come with a whole load of new obligations.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for that. Have we got any questions on food security, vaccines? I'm going to, just to help with the mics, do you want to go, the lady in the second row? And do you want to go next?
Hi, my name is Marina, Bristol University. My question is, basically, with like the active lockdown phase of COVID being in most places probably behind us, well, not everywhere, why, and with like manufacturing and production resuming in the world and, markets rebounding, how come we're still seeing these supply chain distortions, and how come they're so pronounced, like to the point that, like car manufacturers like make cars, but they just don't have the chips to put in them to make them like up to the standard they are supposed to be, so they're just piling them up and can't sell them? Like how come that's an issue, and to what extent is it like a consequence of COVID?
Are they just, Vyoma, are they just hiding behind COVID? Why can't they just get it together?
I'd love to hear what, I'm not a manufacturing expert, so I would want to hear what my...
Would anyone else want to take that one?
I'm happy to give it a try. Actually, I would turn it around and say that given the scale of disruption and collapse in economic activity we've seen during COVID, supply chains have held up reasonably well. We hear a lot about the disruptions in the news. We all saw the articles about the chips and the Jaguar keys that had to be taken and suitcases. And part of it is because production has become so fragmented, so much of it is offshore, so much of it is just in time, and it's reliant often on very specific suppliers. So I think one of the effects of COVID might be that we see a little bit more diversification in terms of trade links, but actually overall the collapse in trade during COVID has been smaller than, for example, during the global financial crisis. The rebound has also actually been pretty sharp, so exports of goods and services are back to before pre-pandemic levels. So, and this is despite the supply chain disruptions that we hear about. So there is actually quite a bit of resilience, but we might see some shift in terms of diversification of supply chains, in terms of moving away maybe a little bit from just-in-time production, but it will come down to the costs and benefits of this and how much uncertainty firms really are willing to take on.
Brilliant. I hope that answers your question. It's not as bad as you think. And then the question over here.
Thank you very much for the lovely talk. It was lovely to hear all of your thoughts. My name is Dhar or Sid for short. I do economics and politics at the University of Bristol. And my question is actually to Vyoma directly. I'm from India myself. And just want to understand, because as you mentioned, as of today, only 27% is completely vaccinated in the country. And of course, with the vaccine, there comes a vaccine booster and the multiple cycles of the additional intakes that you need to give. Will a country like India ever be fully vaccinated in a sense, because China is currently, who has a slightly bigger population than India, has already pretty much vaccinated 3/4 of their population. Will India ever be vaccinated completely? Because with the oncoming rounds of the next few cycles of the vaccine, do you think it's more of a race to herd immunity? Is it just sort of probability game here?
It's such a good question.
Yeah, that's interesting. Let me talk about 2-3 interconnected things. One is the idea that, what happens is global health security tends to weaponize health issues. So from the very beginning, you're hearing about this war on COVID, right? And we're all COVID warriors. You can understand why that satisfies the psyche of all of us. But what I'm trying to say is that this idea of eliminating a disease, let's begin there, is perhaps not the best way of approaching it. We want closures. I understand that. But it's just the scheme of things. So sort of latching on to what you said about global value chains, right? This idea that the pandemic caught us off guard, but the global value chains exist in a way that it was bound to happen. We're interconnected in a way that it is conducive for a vaccine, for a virus to spread the way it did. In terms of the vaccination, the direct answer to your question is yes. In terms of being fully vaccinated, India has a really good track record of running a national immunization program for children, for pregnant women, which takes place on a daily basis. We also have seasonal epidemics. So in terms of giving people preventive prophylactics, that's something. So on the ground, there's the manpower. The money is there. The government has money to run this kind of operation. But again, the reason I started off with speaking about the disease becoming endemic is that we'll all in different ways have to learn to live with the virus. So sure, herd immunity plays a part. How a country's resources match up to the problem is another issue. But yeah, I think why not is what I would say, yeah.
An optimistic answer. Are there any other questions? The lady there in the third row and the gentleman in the front row. Do you
wanna? Tommy, I study economics at the University of Bristol. I'm Nigerian, and I know about like the religious variations and the geographic variations in Nigeria. So, like the northern half of Nigeria is more Muslim, while the southern half is more Christian. I just wanted to ask if like the vaccination uptake in like especially like less in developing countries was consistent with these geographic and like cultural variations, and if you think you could use those in like the next pandemic to target where to start like a program, like a mass like medical program or mass education program first, like start with the group that's least likely to like be willing to do it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, there is a religious divide in Nigeria. You have the Muslim north, the Christian south. And this, you know, we know some of these religious organizations, the view they have about education also differs. For example, you have the Boko Haram north, where they believe that Western education is evil. And anything coming as a result of Western education, including the vaccine, should be seen as evil. Yeah, so that's an harm. So we find this, the little uptake in the vaccine we find in Nigeria, for example, and also in some bi-religious countries in Africa is mostly within the Christian side. Of course, we have the Muslims also, you have an uptake, but in terms of balances, I think it also has to do with the approach religion has to education. So looking at further, if we are to look at in future handling of pandemics, concentration should be more, from your question, if I'm to answer, it should be more on areas where we have a very poor, significant amount of vaccine uptake, which appears to be in the north, among the Muslim north. So it's just, that's the straightforward answer to the question. And that's why I said that if we can engage with the clerics, with the religious leaders in these areas, it would make the work of government much easier.
I think there's a mix-up. Did you have a question as well? No, are you sure? You could put the mic back.
Hi, my name is Lean, and I'm also from the University of Bristol. I would like to ask this question about the Middle East specifically and about Lebanon. I know that you've mentioned that they've witnessed a very severe economic crisis, and over the past year, they've also witnessed a massive explosion as well. And so my question is, how do you disentangle the effect of the pandemic on the economy on top of all the other factors that have exacerbated the problem there?
It's a bit like separating Brexit and COVID. How do you do it in Lebanon?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really difficult, and you can only sort of look at how those different kind of impacts intersect in perhaps people's everyday experience. So I think one useful way of looking at things is through what people's experience might have been during periods of lockdown. So, for example, you know, if you've got a high proportion of people that are working in casualised labour, insecure jobs as taxi drivers, for example, you know, they're going to be hardest hit, and without substantial government support, will struggle to keep afloat. And then, as we've seen particularly since the explosion, which, you know, people hoped would be a sort of low point, and sadly things have really spiraled since then. As the cost of living increased, the economic crisis deepened, you had people who were already in very kind of fragile economic circumstances, facing huge, bills which would be unmanageable for even those in kind of comfortable economic circumstances. So, yeah, it's very difficult to disentangle, and I think it's important really to see how those different aspects intersect in order to understand what's going on. And it is, you're right, it's the same. You know, it's the same everywhere.
Yeah, everyone's got problems, and it's made them worse. And the question in the front row here.
My name's Connor Alone, and I work for the Government Economic Service. My first question is that globally we see that a generation of younger populations have really had their educations compromised, in part because of these lockdowns. What can governments do, and what are the most effective policies from India to the UK to address the losses of education that the global youth have experienced? And if I can ask a second question, maybe particularly for Zsoka, it's more of like an advanced economy maybe question. What's your view, and also of the panel's view, on the decision of European governments to pursue furlough schemes instead of beefing unemployment as they did in America? What are the risks and benefits of furlough versus unemployment benefit?
Okay, so let's start with Bethan with the education question.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of alluded to this in the first panel as well, and there's a lot of evidence for what works in terms of kind of educational interventions to help kids catch up and either regain lost time or just kind of boost attainment across the board. One of the things where we've really focused on in the UK is tutoring as an intervention, but better teacher training, more school time, a focus as well that has become really important is investing in kind of well-being programs and stuff which isn't just academic attainment, is also really important. All that requires a lot of funding. In the UK, you know, we've made interventions which are relatively effective, but perhaps the money and the organisation, it hasn't gone quite far enough. I think perhaps looking a bit more internationally, one of the dangers for school catch-up is that we get really distracted looking at kind of buzzy, innovative interventions, which are often pushed by kind of startup tech companies or sort of aid organisations. In some cases, things look like this kind of spectacular, fantastic intervention because you're giving all kids iPads or something. Those aren't always the the best ways of really getting children to catch up, and in most cases, really investing in teachers, investing in time, getting kind of good class sizes where children can have kind of one-to-one support, and learn in a kind of slightly more personalized one-to-one way with real people really helps. But that's quite costly, and it needs like a really concerted investment, which other countries in Europe, for example, are doing much more than in the UK. There's much more money kind of relative, even in Wales and Scotland compared to England, actually. We're kind of that outlier.
Well, the Government Economic Service has been told. And then the second question was for Zsoka. So furlough, what is it the right way?
So maybe let me start narrow with furlough versus unemployment benefits, and then zoom out a little bit. So this speaks very much to the debate of should we be protecting people or protecting jobs. Now, this is something that is often raised when we talk about really longer-term structural trends, the impact of automation, the impact of offshoring, how much point is there in trying to protect coal mining or manufacturing jobs in cities where they're unlikely to come back. I think there COVID is a slightly different debate, because I think for a long time and in many sectors we still think that this is a temporary shock, and this is something that will last maybe more than a couple of months by now, but we do expect the jobs to return. So in that sense, furlough, I think, very much builds on a lot of the micro level evidence that shows that being employed as opposed to just having income really makes a difference for people's lives. So it increases their satisfaction with life, their general subjective well-being. It helps them maintain the skills. It generally avoids these really scarring effects of unemployment where being out of the labor market, people lose their skills, they lose the habits, and it makes it much more difficult to re-enter. So one of the findings that I personally find very striking, independent of COVID, is that people's mobility really falls after the first year of unemployment essentially to zero, and that holds across the advanced economy. So most people who move either across regions within countries or across countries do so from job to job or possibly from inactivity to employment. Very few unemployed actually move to the places where the jobs are created. Just a few words, I think, on the broader issue of what support packages countries choose to implement. And there we see a lot of variation. So there's all sorts of combinations of countries that have high government spending, but for instance, low government employment, countries that have high state employment and high spending. So it really comes down to sort of social contract and preferences in that sense. There has been a trend increase in both government spending and government employment, and increasing support for state involvement in the economy, and COVID will likely increase that further. So I think there is demand for the state to step in and socialize some of the risks that people are facing.
And that's a global thing. You'd think it's kind of an irreversible trend the world over.
We do see it looking back, and we see it in advanced economies and in emerging markets at sort of differing levels. We see that government spending and state employment do tend to go up after crises, even though state employment in many advanced economies has been falling since the 80s. But we see increasing demand if you ask people if they think there should be a larger role of the state as an owner, as an employer, that there's increased demand for that. The very last thing I would mention there is that we looked at the impact of income and job losses during COVID and how that changes preferences. We find that people who experience such economic hardships are more supportive of a larger state. But I think the interesting twist is if you experienced just an income shock, so for instance, lower wages but not unemployment, you become more supportive of support targeted at the working poor, whereas if you actually lose your job, you become more supportive towards policies that are supportive of the unemployed. So in that sense, choices such as furlough versus unemployment benefits don't only matter for labor markets now, but could also have much longer term impacts in terms of the policies that people would prefer are implemented 10, 15 years from now.
It's interesting that you should say that there's this trend towards big state and more intervention when Lotanna was saying there are all these problems with trust in the state. How do you square that circle, Lotanna?
Yeah, I think it adds to also, basically I agree with what Zsoka said, I think, but you have to look at the foundation, the structure, the political structure, the system. There is a research I did some times ago on looking at how corruption either inhibits or attracts foreign direct investments. And you find out that corrupt countries actually, of course, there are different schools of thought, but what we did, we found that the more corrupt a country is, the lesser foreign direct investment it's able to attract because of the bottlenecks that are involved in bringing them in and the different corrupt. So if we have places where we have institutional failures or corrupt practices that are quite rife in the system, it becomes difficult for people to trust the government. So the problem is not a big government. I mean, big government could be good in some places if the government have good institutions and have good practices and are accountable to the people. But if otherwise is the case, then it becomes a problem that you are concentrating more power on a government that is not accountable and that probably has poor institutional management. So we have to look at it from the political aspect, from the political economics aspect, before we can make a judgment on whether large state involvement is profitable or unprofitable.
Well, remember, as Boris Johnson warns us all, the UK is not a corrupt country. I'm conscious that most of the questions have been in the front. Are there any towards the back? Over here and over there. All of mine have been in the front.
Hello.
Yes, please.
Sahaj, I'm from the University of Warwick. So, you know how you spoke about women in rural India tending to not go for healthcare at all by the fear of isolation or many others. So would you like to shed light on about how social inequalities in India in terms of, say, caste or religion or, again, gender itself, play a role in the quality of healthcare that people are provided, immaterial of the resources they have to access those healthcare facilities?
Yeah, thank you for that. Caste, definitely. As far as structural issues impacting one's health or health seeking is concerned, caste is one of those things that remains pertinent when it comes to care seeking in India. I can give you an example from my field side again. When there were news about, so as I mentioned earlier, people would claim in the village that there's no case of corona. Now that's because they didn't have adequate testing facilities. So there's no way of confirming whether there was COVID or not. But and the village that I worked in was essentially, it's called a Mahadalit community, which means, the lowest of the lowest castes, untouchables. Some people might be familiar with it. And there was a Brahmin woman, an upper caste woman, who commands a certain prestige because she and her family look after the temple in the village. And she heard about one particular symptomatic case of COVID in a lower caste family. And that one single case, on the basis of that, she had the power, or she had the social capital to go around telling people that we will no longer allow ex-community members to visit the village until further notice. In terms of health seeking with primary healthcare facilities, caste, yes, it does play a role. I mean, there's far more awareness about it, but those social dynamics exist. If I'm an upper caste person, a nurse in the healthcare facility, and you're somebody who comes, and you have to remember that your caste more or less intersects with your educational and employment attainment, because that's that level of deprivation, which is very often intergenerational. So if I do encounter somebody as an upper caste who's poor, who would be uneducated, and of a lower caste, those dynamics do come into play, for sure.
And the question over here.
Hi, my name is Thomas. I'm a placement economist at the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, and I'm interested to hear the panel's thoughts on what you think the role of UK and perhaps US as well, foreign policy, should be to support economies and countries that are in a very vulnerable phase of the pandemic compared to us.
Does anyone want to take that?
Maybe let me just give it a little go at it, because recently one of the presidents in an African country has sought for financial aid from maybe not UK and US, but from China, but I think it's still within the same boundaries. The pandemic, actually, it's something that it's a disease or a problem that met many countries unprepared, and especially the more lower income a country is, the more difficult it becomes to grapple with the effects of the pandemic. So it's kind of difficult for every country in these lower income countries to be able to tackle the problems all by themselves. So most likely they seek out for international help. So I think in terms of intervention, from what I've read and what I'm aware of so far, especially pertaining to West African countries, the US specifically has been they've been very gracious in terms of doling out foreign aid to countries that are serious-minded in terms of, because I mean, the truth is this: if they don't do it, once the idea is, once there is a COVID, a major outbreak in any part of the world, then even the most vaccinated country is still at risk because of international travels. And we find out that most of the students that come to the UK to school or go to the US to school, they are from African countries. And to be able to protect the country themselves, they have to make sure that where the countries where the students are coming from, the recipient or the destination of where the students are coming from, that the country is quite safe. Of course, there could be other reasons why they do that, but that could also be part of the reason. So that's why you see the office of this Office of International Foreign Aids in the US, really assisting the Nigerian government, Ghanaian government, Burkina Faso government to really implement both the awareness, creating awareness in the first instance, and also trying to ensure that there is availability of vaccines in these countries.
I sense some slacking in the back. I'd like some more questions
Could
from
I
the back.
maybe quickly
rows.
add to that? Just as and I'd like to talk about vaccines in this regard in terms of, say, the developed world, the role that they can play. And I suppose one of the most disillusioning things that has come across is WHO's platform, the COVAX, which, if you are familiar with it, was allowed countries in the global south to access the COVID vaccines at a subsidized rate, if not free. Now, that's something that a lot of developing countries signed up for, to access vaccines through that, as opposed to different countries contacting manufacturers and bidding at the highest price, and therefore getting whoever could afford to pay could have it. For instance, we know about Canada stockpiling vaccines at this point, right? So I suppose what I'm trying to say is that when you have a platform, when you create an international platform for making subsidized vaccines available, I think it's very important for developed countries to also be signatories and use that platform, because what happens is, if you've created those as the terms of accessing vaccines, but you individually, as a strong economic country, go ahead and claim the highest price to a certain manufacturer, you're not playing by the same rules, and therefore you're undermining the strength of that platform for countries who can't afford to access it. And I suppose I'd like to make a broader point is about this idea about aid, right, and the politics around it. As we've heard from across the panel, COVID-19 is also global, but it's also unique that it doesn't allow you to geographically or racially stratify the virus, right? This is something that originally our ideas of epidemics was that it happens amongst other people in a certain susceptible population or region, but very often now we know that's not the case. So what does that make you think about framing problems and channelizing humanitarian aid? Yeah.
Did you want to come in, Zsoka?
If I can maybe jump in as
Sure.
well, it seems to be a popular question and gives people at the back to think. So I wanted to jump in with a general plea for avoiding turning inwards. I think a lot of the COVID discussions have also resulted in discussions about protectionism, about reshoring, about how, and this is what came up earlier, vulnerabilities in these international supply chains are dangerous, and that would remaining open is crucial for the recovery, but it's disproportionately important for emerging markets and developing economies. So these economies have benefited tremendously from trade, foreign investment, from migration over the last 20, 30 years. And it's really there that protectionist tendencies, that border closures, that travel restrictions would become really binding.
Brilliant. Did you want to come in on that?
No, I won't. I'll leave it to those very good answers.
Are there any more questions? One over there and one over there.
Okay, hi, I'm Mariam. I'm doing a master's in behavioral economics at the University of Warwick. So my question mostly relates to the Middle East. Vaccination rate there is relatively low compared to many other regions around the world. And I was wondering, would it, like the low vaccination rate, would it be completely ascribed to the accessibility of the vaccine, or can some of it be ascribed to the social norms and like how people react towards the vaccine? And if so, how would you how should a government react towards this in order to increase the vaccination rate?
Let's take the problem and then the policy.
yeah. I mean, I think it's important to see the sort of accessibility and kind of cultural issues or social issues all as a piece, because the questions of availability and also just historic trends with vaccinations and so on, which is about long-term availability of healthcare, feeds into whether it kind of feels acceptable or normal to people. And I think we alluded to this earlier, but there's also a certain suspicion when vaccines are distributed through aid networks that have historically been very present, but also treated with suspicion for various reasons. So I think...
Sorry, go on, spell that out. Why is it treated with suspicion?
Well, I mean, there's a historic view, perhaps, of vaccination distribution as being representative of involvement of foreign governments, for example, because they carry the logos of international aid organisations. There's also sort of quite troubling histories of some of these vaccination programs actually being kind of implicated in foreign intervention, where there have been sort of difficult histories in particular parts of the world. But I think when faced with that, it's a responsibility of local government, but also about the ways that aid organisations can work meaningfully with local populations and give agency to the people who kind of know communities that are distributing vaccines, and it might not always be the most appropriate thing to be setting up a big tent with your kind of international UN symbols or whatever on the side. Like these things tend to kind of work better when they're the product of genuine cooperation between kind of local people and health workers who are in the know and know the people they're dealing with and that they need to reach out to, and also genuine kind of education efforts, which perhaps go beyond just the posters of get the vaccine.
Are they not aware of this yet? This big tent problem seems cliche. Do they not? Does the UN not know?
I mean, when I was covering sort of aid stuff before the pandemic, really. But I've always got the impression that it was a thing that is, it's being grappled with within these large organisations. But I think it's a very slow process, and it's about leadership structures which are still kind of based in Europe and the UK, and patterns of kind of management where you get kind of local staff that are junior and are managed by someone who's kind of an expert, but because they've got a degree in international relations or whatever, these systems are very kind of entrenched, and it's difficult to.
It keeps breeding itself. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then we had a question over here.
Hello?
Yep.
Is that working?
Yeah.
Yes, I'm Matt Eddles. I'm an economist from the Office for National Statistics. Just thanks to the panel so far, I think the sort of responses have been quite succinct and calculated. I sort of had a question sort of regarding the sort of vaccine hesitancy and the various forces behind that, whether it be cultural or sort of lack of trust in government in certain countries. I sort of wondered if does this translate internationally to individuals who might be affiliated with those countries, whether they're expats or if they have family in those countries? And if that is founded, what kind of things can be used to combat that? So is it things like education or other forces as well?
That's so interesting. Do you act like your country when you're not there? Does anyone want to take that?
Okay, let me go first. Okay, yeah. So in terms of hesitancy, I think it's also deep-rooted, correctly, like you cited, in the level of education. And we know that most of the poorest country are also, the least educated in some way. And it's basically lack of education that actually makes, because the truth is that everyone is actually tied to a particular belief or not. It's now the level of your education that helps you to see beyond that. So it's, but when the education is not there and it's not really provided, especially in some of these rural areas or in some of these developing economies, then it becomes easy for some of these deep-seated cultural norms to thrive. So the whole idea is that if government, for example, can really invest in education, and that's what I wanted to come back to if I had the time, that one way the government can also, so not just because of this pandemic, but future pandemic. And just a little bit of digression, the issue with the pandemic is also the issue with the climate change problem. There are places we believe that the climate change problem is a hoax, and it's all tied to this. So education, the government really has to fund education in these countries, and when the education is at the right level, then it will really deal with the problem of cultural divides or cultural deep-seated norm problems. So I think education is a fundamental problem.
Fantastic. Well, I think that's all we've got time for, but thank you so much to our panel, and give them a round of applause.